The Ukraine conflict witnessed a remarkable shift with the Ukrainian victory at Nevsky, as they faced a massive Russian offensive. This unexpected turn of events was fueled by the innovative strategies employed by Ukrainian forces, particularly their devastating use of drones, which changed the course of the war. But how did a smaller force manage to defeat such a powerful army? As the conflict between Russia and Ukraine continued, the Nevsky region emerged as a critical area of strategic interest. The Russian forces, determined to advance in eastern Ukraine, concentrated their supplies and troops in an effort to push through the Ukrainian lines. The focus was on Nevsky, a small settlement of great tactical importance, as it provided control over elevated terrain and vital logistical routes. The Russian objective was clear: to break the Ukrainian defenses, advance, and consolidate positions along the eastern front. In the weeks leading up to the attack, the Russians mobilized vast resources to ensure the success of this offensive. Equipment, ammunition, and fuel were transported in large quantities, while heavy artillery was positioned at strategic points to support their mechanized advance. However, this concentration of resources left Russian supply lines vulnerable. The Ukrainian forces, aware of this weakness, prepared for a risky maneuver. As the Russian offensive began, initial advances seemed promising, with columns of tanks and armored vehicles moving forward and encountering only moderate resistance along the Ukrainian lines. However, this apparent retreat was part of a well-calculated Ukrainian strategy. Instead of confronting the Russian force directly, the Ukrainian troops regrouped and prepared for a lightning counteroffensive. Soon after, Ukrainian forces launched a fierce counterattack, targeting the Russian flanks with precision. Ukrainian commanders had meticulously studied Russian movements and used drones for reconnaissance to identify vulnerable points. This swift action surprised the Russians, disrupting their formations and exposing weaknesses in their supply lines. The situation deteriorated rapidly for the Russians, and the advance at Nevsky began to lose momentum. Additionally, the Ukrainian forces leveraged the strategic use of drones. These precision-guided devices were deployed to destroy armored vehicles and dismantle Russian mechanized formations. As the drones relentlessly attacked, Russian tanks were destroyed one by one, leaving their ground forces at a disadvantage. The drone warfare that had previously seemed a secondary element now proved to be one of Ukraine's greatest tactical advantages, enhancing the reach and lethality of their attacks. Nevertheless, the Russians still possessed a powerful weapon at their disposal: thermobaric artillery. In an effort to regain control, they launched massive assaults with this artillery on Ukrainian positions. The explosions were devastating, spreading destruction for miles. The objective was clear: neutralize Ukrainian defensive positions and allow the advance of ground troops. However, despite the strength of the attacks, the well-trained Ukrainian troops, prepared for this eventuality, withdrew to higher ground, avoiding the worst impacts of the explosions. With the failure to capture the settlement of Nevsky, Russian forces found themselves in a precarious position. The excessive attention given to this region and the concentration of resources weakened other parts of their front line, exposing their logistical vulnerabilities. The crucial supply routes necessary to sustain the offensive began to be targeted by advancing Ukrainian forces in key areas. The Russian lines began to crack under the pressure, and what should have been a point of victory was transforming into a symbol of their failure. Each Russian attempt to capture these structures was repelled with heavy losses, and the war of attrition along the river continued. The battle for Nevsky and its surroundings was far from over, but one thing was clear: the Russian strategy was at risk. The rapid and effective Ukrainian counteroffensive, coupled with their advantage in drone usage and knowledge of the terrain, was destabilizing the Russian advance. The coming hours and days would be crucial in determining the course of the war on this front, with the Russians desperately attempting to regroup their forces and the Ukrainians pushing to recapture key positions. With the initial failure at Nevsky, the Russian forces faced a new threat, and their supply lines were now exposed. By concentrating so many resources on a single offensive, the Russian forces neglected the proper protection of the logistical routes that sustained the operation. This vulnerability did not go unnoticed by Ukrainian forces, who swiftly and precisely began attacking these critical routes, cutting off the supply of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements essential for maintaining the momentum of the Russian offensive. Logistics had always been a weak point in Russian planning during the conflict, relying on long transport lines that traversed dangerous and poorly defended territories. Now, the Russians saw their supply trucks becoming easy targets. Well-equipped Ukrainian patrols, coupled with the intensive use of drones, turned Russian roads into deadly traps. Each destroyed convoy represented a significant loss, not just in terms of resources but also in time, a precious commodity in high-intensity warfare. The Ukrainian tactic was clear: destabilize the foundation of the Russian offensive, forcing them to fight under conditions of scarcity. As overloaded and vulnerable Russian trucks moved along the roads of eastern Ukraine, Ukrainian special units launched well-coordinated ambushes, leaving the wreckage of vehicles burning everywhere and creating increasing chaos in the Russian advance attempts. This fragility in the Russian supply routes also heightened the importance of the areas controlled by Ukrainian forces around Nevsky. By securing strategic high-ground positions, the Ukrainians not only made it difficult for the enemy to advance but also created perfect observation points to direct drone attacks. Knowledgeable Ukrainian forces, leveraging the elevated terrain, constantly monitored Russian movement, providing real-time information to their units on the ground and drone operators. Meanwhile, pressure was mounting on Russian commander General Viktor Sokolov. The loss of supplies was paralyzing his offensive, and reports of destroyed vehicles and isolated troops were accumulating. He knew that without the necessary resources, his mechanized forces could not hold the line, much less continue to advance. With each destroyed Russian convoy, Ukrainian forces felt a tightening noose around Nevsky that was loosening. More importantly, the collapse of Russian supply routes allowed the Ukrainians to retake areas they had lost days before.